We got some breaking news in MMA this morning. The highly anticipated fight between heavyweight champ there, Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic at UFC 295 has been called off. UFC President Dana White said Jones suffered a torn pectoral muscle during training, which will require surgery and have him on the sideline for at least 8 months. So what does that mean? The light heavyweight title match between Yair Prochazka and Alex Pereira will be elevated to the main event for November 11th in New York at Madison Square Garden. All right, for more of this, I want to bring in the fellas who know all about this, the best two-piece in the business, the host of the Morning Comeback, my guys, Brian Campbell and Luke Thomas. And BC, I'll start with you. Jones injured again. We've seen this in his career, but how big of a blow is this for UFC moving forward?
I mean, it's a huge blow from the standpoint of commercial viability. And look, this is not a deep pay-per-view card, UFC 295, but what the UFC was selling was the history. Not only is the site Madison Square Garden in New York special for the UFC, but the idea of Jon Jones, who came off of a 3-year layoff earlier this year to move up to heavyweight, win the championship in dominant fashion in his vacant title bout with Cyril Gane, was set to face Miocic, who many people consider the greatest heavyweight in UFC history. This was a top-heavy card that was really being sold almost solely to the idea of Jones returning and really potentially stamping his goatship as the greatest fighter in history and possibly even retiring after and walking off into the sunset. We've seen UFC raise ticket prices. There were rumors going around that $900 was the cheapest price for a seat in the arena for this event, and now Jon Jones is gone. The good news, though, if you're a hardcore fight fan, is the replacement fight might actually be a more viable, more interesting bout toward the actual rankings and the division. But if you're more of a mainstream crossover casual fan, you are buying this pay-per-view or buying this ticket for Jon Jones. And now he's going to be gone for at least 8 months. And consider he turns 37 next July. Unsure the future here for the great one.
Yeah, if I can piggyback a little bit off that, let's do a little bit of inventorying here, right? So we just came off of UFC 294, which lost its main and co-main. They did put in replacements. You had some uneven results as a consequence. Here you have 295's main event falling out, and there are rumors, which I don't want to necessarily elevate to truth, but there at least is some speculation that there could be some injuries headed our way for some of the most important bouts of UFC 296. MMA is very much not like boxing. Yes, fighters in both cases can get injured in camp, but it happens much more frequently in MMA than it does in boxing. And so what ends up happening is the UFC does make it worth the while of the fighters who replace. Last weekend, of course, Volkanovski, Kamaru Usman, right? They got paid a pretty penny to fill in. But they do that at significant risk to themselves as well. Volkanovski now losing the opportunity to become a champ in a second weight class because he took a fight on 12 days' notice and then lost in the first round. So it's good for the consumer that the UFC has such an ability to replace even big fights like Jon Jones. BC's right, not at the box office, but in terms of overall skill. However, it should be noted that these fighters take on an enormous amount of risk to keep these cards in place. There should be some acknowledgement of that.
Injuries are part of the game. You guys know that better than anybody out there. Of course, Dana White doing his best Wolf Blitzer impersonation, saying that he's going to be out 8 months when it comes to Jones here. Look, it's no guarantee he's going to look like before this fight, but I'm curious here, Luke. He's 36. Father Time is undefeated when we talk about guys, but maybe not so much when it comes to Jones. But how much is actually left in the tank in your eyes?
Well, here's the thing. We're talking about heavyweight, and the replacement bout that the UFC put on between Sergey Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall, that will be the new co-main event of heavyweights. These are the next-gen guys, and those guys are pretty good. But the reality is heavyweight is a weak division. Of all the divisions in the male side that the UFC has, it is not even arguable. Heavyweight is the weakest. And so Jon Jones, I was kind of concerned when he had this last 3-year layoff, how was he going to look against Cyril Gane? And then he blew the doors off of him like it was nothing. I'm not saying he's going to do that against Stipe Miocic to the point you raise. A pec tear is pretty significant, at least in terms of the amount of time it requires to rehab. But Jon Jones has been ahead of the game literally every step of the way. From the moment he fought Andre Guzmão in his UFC debut, he's been ahead of the game. So while this is really unfortunate at the box office, and to the point you raise, there are some unknowns about Jon Jones's condition, what I would say is that his opponent, Stipe Miocic, Miocic, who's already basically kind of retired. He's not going to take a fight on short notice. He's going to wait for Jon Jones whenever they're able to get this fight going again. He's already well into his 40s. I'd actually be a little bit more concerned about his situation, not so much from an injury load standpoint, but just what he's going to have athletically by the time they get around to this. So bigger questions in play, less so for Jon Jones, even though his injury is significant, but certainly for that main event whenever it does happen.
Well, to take that Jon Jones situation in a different direction, I wonder, though, if there's some level of this sustaining the length of Jones's career. There was a lot of talk. Luke Thomas and I debated it regularly on Morning Combat about, would this be Jon Jones's last fight here against Stipe Miocic, or would the potential of the dominance he may be able to show even against these next level new generation heavyweights, would that have kept him around? If this injury is at least going to keep Jones sidelined until next summer, and as long as the UFC doesn't strip him of that title, which I don't believe they would, given his star power and the history he's brought to the sport, I do wonder if this injury and the length and the recovery might rejuvenate Jon Jones's interest in staying around, eventually having a title unification against the winner of this replacement bout between Aspinall and Pavlovich. And maybe this keeps it going forward, because what Luke said is the truest part. In heavyweight, you don't worry about age. And when you consider the second half of Jon Jones's career, it's been filled with a lot of drama and distractions, but not a ton of cage time, not a ton of miles being added to the odometer. I do wonder if this long recovery allows Jon Jones to look around and realize he does have a lot left to give to this sport if he wants to, and still would be a favorite against basically any heavyweight on the UFC roster.
A lot of questions here. Hey, guys, we got about 90 seconds before we go, because we do know there is a card that will happen. And BC, you kind of touched on it. I want to get your thoughts on what you see. Give me some of the highlights from this card here in 295.
Yeah, look, this replacement bout, which will now serve as the co-main event, he'll have the interim heavyweight title at stake. And it's an interesting scenario because Tom Aspinall has to do the short turnaround, like Lou mentioned, but he's facing a destroyer in Sergey Pavlovich, who is riding 5 consecutive first-round knockouts and looks to be the absolute real deal. He's going to have to prove it against a very well-rounded fighter in Aspinall, who's rebounded well from a disastrous injury. This is a very good fight that sort of defines the future of the division. But look at the injury concerns. This new main event, Prochazka Pineda, moving up from the co-main event, is only here because champion Jamal Hill got injured, and Jamal only became champion because champion Yuri Prochazka got injured and was forced to give up his title. It shows the volatility of the sport, but 2 heavy hitters atop the marquee for sure.
No doubt about it. That Prochazka versus Pineda fight has, I mean, all the makings of fireworks. Alex Pineda was a 2-weight division kickboxing champion in glory. Prochazka is absolutely a wild man when he gets out there. That's going to be a gunfight if ever there was one. We already told you, Pavlovich and Aspinall, probably in either case, you could make an argument for the future of that division, maybe a little bit more so in the Aspinall direction, but that remains to be seen. I also want to point out one more on there. Mackenzie Dern versus Jessica Andrade. Dern has been someone that the UFC has really wanted to turn into a star. She finally appears to be ready. It's going to be on this big card at Madison Square Garden. You're not going to get the Jon Jones halo, and that might slow some things down, but there is still plenty of action and important fights for respective divisions on this UFC 295 main card.
Plenty of smoke still coming for New York City there in 295, as you guys just mentioned there. Luke Thomas and Brian Campbell always getting us on the same page as pen and paper. Want to take a look at that card again, of course, talking about that event that has now moved to the light heavyweight title matchup between Prochazka and Pineda. They're elevated as the main event, so we'll see how that pans out. Of course, no Jon Jones, but everything going there November 11th at Madison Square Garden when it comes to UFC 295. Hey, don't forget the Morning Combat, the guys I just mentioned. If you missed anything they talked about, you can catch them there. Always getting us right on the mat, boxing, or whatever else is out there, of course. You can watch them and listen wherever you stream your podcasts.